very briefly, and then perhaps we can have some conversation on these matters. Perhaps a little more about these biblical categories for migration, where I distinguish the Adamic and Abrahamic forms of migration, just on the basis of, you might say, biblical typology. But how do these apply to migration as we know it today, as a 20th, 21st century phenomenon, and particularly for the African diaspora, which is at the center of our thoughts this morning? We've tried to see migration in the scriptures, and I think have found that it's an essential feature of the scriptures, not an incidental one, and one that can attract several layers of theological reflection. We now have to ask how far these biblical themes that we've been apply in the modern world, and in particular, how far can they be used to interpret this phenomenon that, for lack of a better term, I've called the Great Reverse Migration. Some features of the modern African diaspora readily suggest analogies with the Adamic and the Abrahamic categories of migration. Forced involuntary exile, forms such a major theme in prophecies like Isaiah and Jeremiah. Forced involuntary exile has become a feature of the African continent. Millions have fled ruin at home and found that migration only brings more misery. Which, in the whole world, is the country which has most refugees? The answer is Kenya. A huge proportion of the world's refugees are African. In calling this type of migration Adamic, because it's associated with deprivation, with loss, I would be very anxious not to suggest, even by implication, that the origin lies in divine judgment. We can, however, I think, invoke the fact that in Israel's long history, Adamic migration, with all the misery and loss that attended, is represented not as destructive, but as redemptive. Exile is not permanent. Exile leads to renewal. Exile leads to reconstruction. Think of the note that runs through Isaiah 40 to 55. So the Adamic migration of the Babylonian exile issues in the message of comfort to God's people. Go on, and in those same chapters in Isaiah 40 to 55, we get the picture of the servant, God's servant, the suffering servant, who vicariously absorbs the punishment of his people. and wins back the freedom of many, and after much suffering and rejection is finally vindicated. Though he is taken away to judgment and death, he wins back the freedom of many, makes intercession for the transgressors in the old translation, sees his seed, sees descendants, that the one who appeared to be cut off from any descendants. And we see how that passage is appropriated by the Lord himself and by New Testament writers as the picture of the Son of Man and what the Son of Man accomplishes. I was interested to see a recent example from South Sudan of how Isaiah chapter 18 is being interpreted. Isaiah 18, you may recall, is one addressed beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. There's a land where the sound of wings is heard. From that land ambassadors come down the Nile in boats made of reeds. Go back, swift messengers, take a message back to your land divided by the rivers. The Upper Nile, the Sudan, Cush, as the Hebrews called it. And the message is given there about how this tall, smooth-skinned people who are feared all over the world are to receive a terrible visitation. The corpses of their soldiers will be left exposed to the birds and the wild animals. In summer, the birds will feed on them. In winter, the animals. A terrible picture of destruction awaiting the people of Cush. But the chapter goes on. A time is coming when the Lord Almighty will receive offerings from this land divided by rivers, this strong and powerful nation, this tall and smooth-skinned people who are feared all over the world. They will come to Mount Zion, where the Lord Almighty is worshipped. That Cush itself has a post-destruction future. There's a message of hope in Isaiah, even for Israel's enemies and the source for distant peoples like the Cushites. I was reading a Nuer interpretation of this chapter. Here are Nuer Christians reading this prophecy in the light of the events and experiences of the devastating wars that Sudan and South Sudan have known. And in their homeland, they recognize the dreadful disasters proclaimed by the prophet. But again, in accordance with prophecy, these people return to the Lord. What's the evidence of it? The growth of the Nuer church. And when the remittances from those who'd gone into exile in the West began to make an impact on those who stayed in the homeland, another part of the prophecy seemed to be fulfilled. Disaster in the homeland had led to the exile of many, and as in biblical times, the foreign exiles tend to come from the productive sectors of the economy. But the gifts of the exiles eventually enabled the Nuer to make gifts to the Lord, and the sacrifices were offered. Isaiah 18 was fulfilled in the events of the beginning of this century. The migration of the Nuer exiles, children of the biblical Cushites, led people from destruction to recovery, societal and spiritual renewal, economic surpluses that the migrants could share with those that were left behind. It's an interesting example, I think, of local theologizing that combines biblical reflection with reflection on the unspeakable horrors that this community had undergone in recent years. In making sense of these experiences, this group of Christians has followed the biblical precedent in identifying Adamic migration and redemption. It's not the end of the story. Even the refugee story is to lead to restoration. But modern Africa has seen Abrahamic migration too, on a huge scale. The voluntary removal in hope of a better life for oneself or one's descendants. And some of the characteristic essential to Abrahamic migration is to be found there too. A sense of divine calling. It's the three-dimensional aspect of Abrahamic migration that raises particularly important issues. In the biblical model, Abraham responds to the hope of a better future, but doesn't experience much of that promised blessing himself. It's his descendants who receive the land. But the fullest meaning and purpose of Abraham's migration, a migration that's undertaken in response to the divine call, is that others will receive benefit ultimately. Ultimately, indeed, all families of the earth are blessed in Abraham's descendants. So, the migrants, that is, have a mission to the host community where they have migrated, and a mission beyond that to the whole world. Commonly, the migrant consciousness takes a new form in the second or the 1.5 generation, people born in the diaspora but growing up in the new society, who inevitably see the world in a different way from their parents and acquire a mission of their own. But a new dimension has emerged, I think, with the spiritual poverty of the post-Christian West. In its most developed form, service to the migrant community grows into mission to the world, the Abrahamic all families of the earth that are to be blessed through the migration. That leads us to the thought with which we close, that the great reverse migration, whatever else may happen in the years that lie ahead, may turn out to be as important as the great European migration was, that created a world order now, as we said, in process of disintegration. The great reverse migration is certainly got the potential to influence the future of Christianity. And that is what your deliberations today are all about. I have taken sufficient time of this, though, for my part, though I'm very happy to engage in conversation now for the rest of this session. Is that right? Oh, I've lost Harvey. Is he about? Here he is. Yes.
Yeah, so I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, and I would like to open up space. If you have a question, it won't be many questions, but if you have a question, would you please write okay. Yeah.
Great, Professor Walls, thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to pick up on a comment that you made at the start of your presentation, and it was really, I don't think I've heard you on this before, but it was really, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on, given that the great reverse migration of peoples from Africa, Asia, Latin America, your point about how you thought that African Christianity, in a sense more than any other of these other migrations, were more representative of Christianity today than perhaps Latin American or Asian migration. If you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. It's, again, I think we look back to the processes of the last century. Think of not too long ago, we were celebrating the centenary of the Great World Missionary Conference held in Edinburgh in 1910. That conference was the high watermark of the missionary movement from the West. It's meeting to discuss how the whole gospel can be brought to the whole world, and making plans for doing it. Who was there? The delegates were divided into 3 groups. Those from Europe, those from Britain, those from North America, and those from continental Europe, with another little pocket for Australia and New Zealand and the white population of South Africa. That was the mission. These were the missionaries. And the assembly hall was packed with them. There were 14 Asians present. And they had an important effect on the conference. The 2 best known speeches that are remembered, one was from an Indian and the other from a Chinese. But they were just a token of what was to come. There was no African delegate. One African got there by using his elbows. And he's so obscure, and I didn't know he was there. Somebody else found he was there. He's not in the list of delegates at all, but he was. And the conference had decided not to discuss Latin America at all. It raised too many problems. Very convincing plans were made for the international cooperation. It's important that we work together in this. International cooperation again between missions based in Europe, North America. 1910, it all seemed possible. The whole world was accessible. The frontiers were breaking down. You were having difficulty with those world empires. They wouldn't let you talk to Muslims and so on. But on the whole, those empires appeared to be offering stability for the future. 4 years later, the world erupts in the chaos of the First World War. And missionaries of one country are being interned by the governments of other countries. Or, yes, you've got your vision of the evangelization of the world, but one by one, the props by which you assume it's going to be taking place are removed. The war is followed by the Great Depression, and the financial base of missions collapses. It's followed by yet another war, and that war introduces weapons of mass destruction that hint at the possible destruction of the planet. The missionaries are no longer, after the First World War, coming out in the numbers that they did before. And a whole generation had been lost in France and Flanders anyway. Yet, what the fathers and brethren at Edinburgh saw in 1910 was a true vision. The evangelization of the world was taking place, but it wasn't in the parts of the world or by the means that they expected. Read the report of Commission 1 that shows you the bright spots and the great upbeat note that you get in the reports on India, on China, on Japan. This is where you're expecting the great leap forward. Read the reports on Africa, and you get some interesting comments. One is, the general tone of the report on Africa is that things aren't as discouraging as they might be. But another part of the word is the evangelization of inland, of the interior of Africa, has as yet hardly begun. And another one is, it is a real possibility that Africa may become a Muslim continent. In fact, the world as we see it today, with that Western missionary movement gone into its old age, saw in the course of the 20th century this huge movement in tropical Africa, which wasn't visible in 1910 at all. That's where God was preparing a people for the next stage of world evangelization. Some other parts of the world, certain parts of Asia, not the big ones that appeared so hopeful in 1910. What was happening in that line going through Southeast Asia? even 60 years ago, Tibet was called land closed to the, Nepal was called a land closed to the gospel. It now has a vigorous church. Huge. So all these things, of course, are great warnings to people in my sort of job not to make prophecies. My job has to be history, not prophecy. But you can also see how God works. And I think that does mean there has been a special significance in the African Christian diaspora, just in force of numbers. Just as Europe was representative Christianity for a time, there were Christians outside Europe, but the work had to be done in Europe. So now I think you have this mass of critical mass of African Christians. What are they going to do with the mission? The fathers and brethren in Edinburgh didn't know how close they were to the end of theirs. So that I think, is the terms I was thinking.
Andrew, thank you. I wondered if you could elaborate on another comment you made, that colonialism heralded the beginning of Western secularization.
Thank you. The Great European Migration starts when Europe is calling itself Christendom. It's Christianity on the map. And these people genuinely desire that the salvation of other people. How are they to be saved? They're surely to be brought into Christendom. You've already had these devastating wars that have followed the Muslim occupation of Christian lands in the East. Let's remember, by the way, we talked about representative Christianity in Europe. Before that, the representative Christian part of the world was the Middle East and North Africa. If you think of where the leading churches are at various times in history, you would need to go to Syria, to Egypt, to Tunisia, to Turkey, to Iraq. Iraq, again, a country with a huge missionary record, thousands of Iraqi missionaries who went out in those centuries. The divine baton, you might say, is handed on from one place to another, from one people to another, at different times, in different places, different parts of the world have responsibility for leadership in the Christian world. Anyway, here are Western Christians very conscious of being Christian. One thing which happens in Central and South America is, okay, yes, the way forward is what we've been doing with Crusade. The most successful of the Crusades took place at the same time as Columbus's journey to America. The most successful of the Crusades was the one that broke Muslim power in Spain and regained Spain for Christendom. And that the Muslim power falls in 1492, the year of Columbus's voyage and Columbus's Columbus actually saw the surrender of the Muslim monarch in Granada. But that starts the great European migration, and the Americas become the focal point of migration. And in Mexico and Peru, the Spanish adopt the crusading model. You smash down the altars, you compel, you baptize whole populations, as the whole population of Europe was baptized. And, well, Latin America has its own Christian history, and it's not all bad. That's another story of how God uses these things. In Africa, you begin with diplomacy. And yes, in a few places, at Mbanza on the mouth of the Congo, in Benin for a time, in Wari for a time, a Christian state emerges, one of the states of Christendom, because the chiefs have converted and have become Christendom like European Christendom. But there's no hope of either diplomacy or conquest doing much in the Chinese Empire, or the Japanese Empire, or the Mughal Empire. Those are entities too big for conquest. Nor is it really possible in most of Africa. So after a while, the nations of Europe who have begun the great European migration settle for survival or for economic viability. It's profitable trade, but we lose interest in Christianity, the spread of Christianity. It's too difficult. And it's at this point, I think, that the division comes between the religious profession of Europe and its economic and political interests. And Europe opts for the economic and political interests. So the little places, you've got your small Christendoms like Goa or Macau, but you don't attempt the conversion of India or China. That's not enough for the radicals in Christendom. They desire Christ's kingdom. And this is where the missionary movement comes from. And it begins, as we've seen, in a Catholic phase in Catholic Southern Europe. Takes Protestants on the whole another couple of hundred years to catch up. But when they do, they come in with a bang. But the missionary is not a crusader, and he has also parted from that association with the survival and prosperity mode. And I think that's going back to Kathy's question, where I see secularization beginning. That you're making a conscious vote for putting economic and political interests first, and moving away from the nature of the Christian message. It's a mercy. Think what would have happened otherwise. Just as we may be grateful that some of the desires that people like William Wilberforce had for a state mission to India didn't happen. But you cannot. But God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform.
Final question. The last one, Andy.
Thank you. Another word that you used earlier on was the word persecution,
Yes.
and how persecution was key in the spread of the church.
Yes.
Given the rise of a new form of Islamic fundamentalism in this last decade, given the expulsion or the journeying of Eritreans particularly, and as well as the pressures with Iraq and Syria, what do you see as both the historical perspective and the challenges for the church going forward as it relates to persecution, or as persecution relates to the church, should I say?
Thank you, and I wish I could give a worthy answer to that question, but it would require the gift of prophecy, I think, which I confess I don't have. That it is occurring, I'm sure, is the case. We have seen, particularly in the Middle East, here, Iraq, the great missionary nation in early centuries, and a deliberate attempt to exterminate Christianity completely from the country. And in any case, a drastic reduction of the number of Christians there. Yet, part of the, much of that has been movement into exile and to the West. And maybe that will have its part in the divine dispensation for the future. I don't know what it is. But yes, I think persecution continues to be, if you look at over the whole historical, over the whole history of Christianity, yes, persecution has brought people, has furthered Christian witness by moving them somewhere else. There have been other times where the Christian community seems to disappear. But and I think perhaps that's as much as I can say, which is probably a long-winded way of saying I don't know. But I would do so with the confidence that, like all these forms of migration, if we follow those principles of by which the divine initiative for salvation is displayed throughout the scriptures, then we can look to an ultimate redemptive purpose, which we must see, I think, in that last picture of all in the scriptures. If you go to the 21st of Revelation and look at that New Jerusalem. Remember in Isaiah 18, the Cushites are going to bring their offerings to Zion. In the picture in Revelation 21, the gifts of all the nations are brought in to the city, a New Jerusalem, and some of them come through the gates on the north, and some by the gates on the south, and some by the gates on the east, and some by the gates on the west. Through the 12 gates of the city, the glory of the nations is brought, all offerings to the Lord of hosts.
All right, we'll break for lunch now. And